A family in rural Kentucky falls victim to a brutal crime.
There's been a massive struggle.
Blood on the floor, blood on the doors, blood on the walls. My first thought was, what kind of monster are we dealing with?
Had someone targeted the family for payback?
He said that he would kill them both.
Or was something more sinister afoot?
They were going to kill her, and he had to protect her.
As the investigation unfolds, the truth reveals a forbidden love affair between a young couple and a deadly conspiracy fueled by desperation and rage.
He worshipped the ground she walked on. It was obsessive. It was possessive.
He basically fell under her spell.
I think the mixture of the two of their personalities and their relationship was a little strike of a match near an explosive gas tank.
Mount Vernon, Kentucky is a small, close-knit community where residents value their slower pace of life. Mount Vernon is also where Chara and Henry Bryant raised their large and loving family.
Henry and Chara both went to Rockcastle County Middle School and High School. Chara actually crushed on Henry in high school.
Even though Chara liked Henry in high school, they dated other people and married other people, and those marriages didn't work out. And then a chance encounter brought them back together. They started dating. Their kids got along well together. Seemed perfect.
Whenever you saw Henry and you saw him have Chara in his arms, there was nothing but smiles. I mean, he was smiling all the time. And she thought Henry hung the moon and stars.
The young couple married in 2002 and moved in together with Chara's 3 children from previous relationships.
Living with Chara and Henry were Chara's kids, Austin, Caitlin, and Brooklyn. And then Chara and Henry had a little girl, Madison, and everyone was thrilled.
The Bryant family was very close. They were close. Chara tried to keep a relationship between the girls where, not only was that their mother, but someone that they could talk to. She wanted to make them feel like they could talk to her anytime.
Henry worked all of the time, and he done his best to give everybody what they needed, what they wanted. He'd spoil them.
They were the typical family that, it's the definition of love.
In 2016, Chara's oldest son, Austin, left home for college, while her oldest daughter, Caitlin, graduated from high school and prepared for her own future.
The 3 sisters still lived at home, and they were all very close. Madison, the youngest, was entering 8th grade and getting ready to start high school, and 16-year-old Brooklyn was starting her junior year, so the prospect of college was on the horizon.
But school hadn't been the only thing Chara's second daughter, 16-year-old Brooklyn, had started to show an interest in.
Brooklyn was at an age where she was growing interested in boys, and they were growing interested in her too, and she met a particular young man who lived in that area named Chris Evans.
Brooklyn was working at a fast food chicken restaurant, and Chris had came through the drive-thru, and they had developed, I guess, through social media connection, messaging back and forth.
Brooklyn always came into school happy and was talking about him and sneaking and texting him in class.
I was happy for Chris and Brooklyn both because I knew Chris was a very nice guy. You can even call Chris a gentleman, actually. He was a very nice, bright guy that always was talking to people.
Brooklyn felt really ecstatic, happy, in the puppy dog love stage of a relationship. I think that Chris had made her feel like she was a grown-up, and she had felt like she was doing something, like she mattered and was becoming something.
While Chara and Henry accepted that Brooklyn was growing up, they maintained a close watch over their daughter.
Chara and Henry didn't know much about Chris other than what Brooklyn was telling them. She said he was a nice guy with a nice family, polite, and treated her well. Chara and Henry trusted Brooklyn and her judgment, but they made it clear that they wanted her to stay focused on her schoolwork before things got any more serious between them.
In June of 2017, the Bryant family kicked off the summer with an annual family vacation.
Henry and Chara and all of their 4 kids went to Florida. It was beautiful from the pictures I've seen.
But life for the loving family was about to take a tragic turn. It's June 8th, the morning after the Bryants returned from their family road trip. Oldest son Austin has returned to his college dorm, while the rest of the family is at home in Mount Vernon. But at 7:30 a.m., local police receive a disturbing 911 call from the Bryant residence.
There's a 911 call from a person identifying herself as Brooklyn, who said that she had located her parents and there was blood all over the place.
Brooklyn tells the dispatcher that she had just woken up to take her dog outside when she noticed the glass door to her parents' bedroom had been shattered and forced open.
She had gone in and identified that her mom was laying in the bed and her stepdad was in the bathroom and neither one of them were breathing. She said she had no idea what happened.
First responders rushed to the Bryant residence.
When the officer initially arrived, there was 3 other persons inside the residence. They were identified as Caitlin Witt, Brooklyn Reynolds, and Madison Bryant. Of course, they were upset from the scene. Unfortunately, each of them had gone to the room where both victims were located. We had a deceased person lying in the bed. She was identified as Chara Bryant by Brooklyn. The other victim was identified as Henry Bryant. Mr. Bryant was located in the bathroom.
It's clear to officers that both Henry and Chara had been shot to death.
The initial officer contacted his dispatch, who directed me to come to that scene. My first thought was, wow, this is such a violent attack. So my initial reaction was, gosh, who am I dealing with? What kind of monster are we dealing with?
Coming up, detectives attempt to make sense of a baffling crime.
There was broken glass line on the outside, which made it seem as if it had been broken from the inside out.
And a possible suspect is revealed.
He told Henry that he would kill them.
On June 8, 2017, Rockcastle County, Kentucky police discovered 36-year-old Henry Bryant and his 35-year-old wife, Chara, shot to death in their own home. The victims' daughters, who reported finding their parents, are transported away to the police station as detectives process the crime scene.
We made an initial walk around the house, taking photographs and observing, looking for any possible evidences that we could see. Didn't look like there was any forced entry on the door, what I would consider the initial passageway. The only damage to the outside of the residence that I was able to see was the broken sliding glass doors that was attached to the master bedroom.
Inside the bedroom, detectives pieced together evidence of a vicious attack.
It was a very bloody scene. A lot of blood on the floor, blood on the doors, blood on the walls, handprints from an apparent struggle.
Chara had what appeared to be a single gunshot wound to the head.
She was shot cold-blooded while she slept. She still had covers around her, and her head was still on the pillow.
There appeared to be a trail of blood from the bedroom to the bathroom where Henry was laying there dead.
It's obvious with Henry Bryant, there'd been a massive struggle, obvious by the crime scene that there'd been a fight.
He was kneeling on his hands and knees and was slumped over on the ground. He was holding a towel to his face to perhaps give himself some first aid from an apparent gunshot wound to the facial area. That man fought for his life after being seriously injured.
As CSIs continue to process the house for forensic evidence, detectives make a curious discovery when examining the broken glass door to the master bedroom.
There was broken glass line on the outside, which made it seem as if it had been broken from the inside out.
Typically, if there was a break-in, glass would be shattered going on the inside of the house. So I thought it was a little unusual that I see glass on the outside. I went to the back door to look to see if there was any pry marks, any break-in marks. I saw nothing had been pried. Nothing looked like it had been forced open.
Detectives theorize that the perpetrator had likely entered the home through an unlocked door and then fled the scene through the glass door in the bedroom.
Could the family have left their doors unlocked because they lived in a generally safe area? Or the other thought is they let the attacker in because it was someone that they knew.
At an initial glance, detectives have a hard time discerning a motive.
We didn't find anything that would show us that a robbery had occurred. We didn't see any evidence of drawers being gone through, clothing being rifled through. There was computers that would have been easily been taken. Drawers hadn't been opened or jumped out in the event that there was drugs or cash or weapons. So we had no evidence that there was a robbery.
Detectives next turn their attention to the victim's 3 daughters, 19-year-old Caitlin Witt, 16-year-old Brooklyn Reynolds, and 12-year-old Madison Bryant.
We transferred them so I could conduct an initial interview with each of them to see what they may have heard, seen, or known that had happened.
Caitlin explains that the family had just returned home from vacationing in Florida.
Caitlin told me that they had been on a trip. They were all very tired. They'd gotten home the day before this had occurred. She said that they came back home and just relaxed and tried to catch up on some rest. She had used a computer and some headphones to watch videos and listen to music as she went to sleep. She had gotten up early. She had planned on going to work, but she decided she wasn't going to go to work. She wasn't feeling well. She had decided, I think, she was just going to call in work at that point.
That's when Caitlin says she heard her sister Brooklyn calling for help.
Caitlin said Brooklyn must have been taking the dogs out for a walk because she saw Brooklyn in the backyard screaming. They could both see the shattered glass door and their parents' blood all over their bedroom.
Detectives asked Caitlin if she had heard any sounds of a struggle or gunfire in the house.
Caitlin said she hadn't heard anything. I could tell that she was numb. She was shocked that this happened and couldn't believe that she didn't hear it.
Detectives next speak to Brooklyn. She confirms her sister's story that she was taking the dog out when she discovered that the door to her parents' bedroom had been shattered.
Brooklyn saw the glass. Then she said she went inside, saw her mom, and called for help, exclaimed to her sisters that something was wrong. At that point, Brooklyn had called 911, and she said, well, we just didn't know what to do. So they stayed together, waited till the police arrived, and went outside. She also said that she didn't hear anything. She said she heard no noise, no cars coming or going. She had seen no one.
Finally, detectives turned their attention to the youngest sister, Madison.
Madison said that she had been upstairs and listened to music that night. When she heard the exclamation of her sister that something was wrong, she'd gone outside. Unfortunately, seen her mom and her father deceased. She did exhibit what I would consider to be a very natural reaction to something emotional, numb, sad.
But detectives are baffled by one common detail shared by each of the sisters.
What was really odd about this, we had several shots fired in a home. We had a struggle in a home. And we had 3 people that were inside the home that heard nothing. So that was odd. That struck us as odd that each of them said, I didn't hear anything.
Still, detectives know that at the late hour the shootings likely took place, it's plausible the girls may have slept through the nightmare unfolding just down the hall.
We all agreed with their tiredness. With headphones on, it's possible that you not hear a gunshot.
Detectives release the girls into the custody of family members and notify their brother Austin, who is back in his dorm room 60 miles away. Loved ones are devastated to learn of the Bryants' tragic passing.
My sister pulled up and she just says, get in. We need to go. And from that point on the ride home is when she told me everything. I didn't want to believe her. I didn't believe her. I was like, no, I've got to figure out what's going on. The next day I talked to Austin. I talked to Caitlin. I saw Madison. I messaged Brooklyn because Brooklyn had went to her dad's. They were in shock that they just lost someone they loved.
The first thing I thought of was, I hope that the kids are all right. I was wondering who person into their house. So it had to be somebody that was close to them. It was devastating.
Nobody knew why it had happened or how it had happened or who was even involved. The whole town was kind of running around rampant, trying to figure out who had done it or what the motive even was.
But when detectives reach out to the Bryants' extended family, they learn that Chara and Henry had recently developed problems with Chara's brother, Cody Witt.
There was an argument that I learned about between Cody and Henry and Chara.
Chara's mother explains that the trouble had started at a family barbecue a year earlier. Cody had approached Chara about money she had borrowed from him, and a fight had ensued.
I spoke to Chara and Cody's mother, who said it was at her house where that had occurred. She said it was over money, and the incident became physical between Henry and Cody.
Henry basically told him not to come back to the house, and he told Henry that he would kill them both.
Was Chara's brother responsible for his sister and brother-in-law's murders? When detectives try to locate Cody for questioning, they learn that no one has seen him in several days.
He vanished one night with all of his belongings and his pickup truck. He didn't tell anyone where he was going, and no one knows where or why.
And that's what ultimately the family was like, okay, yeah, he done it.
Coming up, police fear they're running out of time to catch a killer when a surprising new motive surfaces.
She told me that, oh, by the way, my mom sells drugs. So that was news to me.
Obviously, that is not unusual for people to commit murder over drugs.
Police in Rockcastle County, Kentucky, are investigating the shocking home invasion murders of Henry and Chara Bryant.
Nothing like this happens around here. To hear a double murder in this town is, something unspeakable.
Detectives are searching for Chara's brother, 34-year-old Cody Witt, who had threatened both Chara and Henry nearly a year earlier.
Rumors started, spiraling around because we live in a small town that it could have been Cody, Chara's brother.
As police dig into Cody's background, they uncover evidence of an active warrant for his arrest related to drug trafficking charges.
I had personal knowledge of Mr. Witt. I knew that Cody had been involved in street-level narcotics. At that point, Cody had an outstanding warrant for his arrest, so he was what we would consider on the run.
Detectives were having trouble tracking him down, and according to family and friends, no one had seen him or knew where he was for at least a few weeks. So they put out feelers. If anyone hears from Cody, let us know.
A few days later, police are stunned when Cody contacts them himself. He insists he had nothing to do with the murders, but says he isn't ready to turn himself in for questioning.
I actually spoke to him by phone. He assured me that he had nothing to do with it. In fact, Cody said, he called me by name. He said, Brian, you know me, you know what I do, you know what I'm about, you know what I've done, but I've not done that. I've never hurt my sister. I would never do anything like that.
Cody gave detectives an alibi. He said he'd been out of town for several months trying to escape his past, and actually gave a name of someone who could verify that.
I spoke to a gentleman who said, hey, Cody was with me. I'm a convicted felon. Cody's not even allowed to be here, and I could get in trouble if I tell you this. But he did verify that Cody had been there, who he had been there with, and what time he left.
Detectives, however, aren't willing to confirm Cody's alibi on the word of a convicted felon. They continue their search for Chara's brother, and they soon get a tip that Cody Witt has been spotted in a nearby town. A surveillance team confirms Cody's whereabouts, and detectives move in and arrest Cody on suspicion of murder. Once in custody, Cody continues to maintain his innocence.
I did conduct an interview with Cody once he was apprehended. He offered to take a polygraph test. He spoke freely with me, and to be honest, was believable.
Detectives still need more before they can eliminate Cody as a suspect. They obtain a warrant and search his truck for evidence that might connect him with the double murder of his sister and brother-in-law.
That search warrant did not yield any evidence. We found no physical evidence or DNA evidence that would link Cody Witt to this crime at all.
Obviously, when we eliminate the brother as a suspect, we really go back to square one. You have 3 people in the house, you have 2 dead bodies. We really start focusing on the people in the house.
With Cody cleared of any charges connected to the murders, investigators turned back to Henry and Chara Bryant's 3 daughters for follow-up interviews.
Maybe if they didn't do it, do they know who did it, or did they put somebody up to it, or that's really a concern.
Once again, Caitlin and Madison are unable to shed any light on who might have wanted to harm their parents. But this time, 16-year-old Brooklyn surprises detectives with an unexpected allegation about her mother.
Brooklyn said, "Did you know my mom sells drugs?" Once that was said, it is a possible motive.
We obviously have a huge opioid problem, and so that is not unusual for people to commit murder over drugs.
Brooklyn gave me details that her mom had asked her to be involved, that she too had been involved, that she had actually made some money on the side helping her mother sell pills. And in fact, on their way back from Florida, they had stopped to do shopping. Brooklyn said that her mother instructed everyone to go to the shopping area while Brooklyn and her mother went to deliver something which she assumed was pills or money for pills.
When detectives ask why she hadn't shared this information sooner, Brooklyn claims that she was trying to protect her family's reputation.
She didn't want to make her mom look bad.
Investigators decide to look further into Brooklyn's claim that her mother sold drugs, but have a hard time finding any evidence to support it.
We found no evidence that I'm aware of that they were using drugs, on drugs, selling drugs, or involved in the drug trade.
Is Brooklyn telling the truth? And if not, why would she lie? Detectives take a closer look at the teenager. They speak with her friends and learn that Brooklyn's relationship with her mother and stepfather had grown increasingly strained in the weeks before the murder. The trouble, it turns out, had to do with Brooklyn's relationship with her boyfriend.
I learned that Brooklyn had a boyfriend. His name was Christopher Evans.
Friends tell police that Brooklyn and Chris had fallen hard for one another.
It was very intense. They talked about getting married.
The way that Brooklyn talked about Chris, his feelings for her were very deep. Brooklyn was in love with Chris. The way that it sounded, their relationship, it seemed like she would do anything for him.
But Brooklyn had initially kept one important detail about her relationship with Chris a secret from her parents.
They knew she had a boyfriend, they just didn't know the extent and age of said boyfriend.
She had dated him since she was 15. Chris was 22, I think, at the time. Quite a bit of age difference.
Chara and Henry had eventually discovered Brooklyn was dating an older man when they checked her cell phone and learned not only Chris's real age, but also the intimate details of his and Brooklyn's romance.
There was messages where they would share photos to each other, and that apparently they had learned that there were intimacies between Brooklyn and Chris.
They pretty much said, don't see this boy anymore. Or this man, he's 22 years old, she's 16.
Despite her deep feelings for Chris, Brooklyn's friends tell police that she'd obeyed her parents and ended the relationship on April 8, 2017.
Char and Henry had her get on speakerphone, make a phone call to Chris, and break up so they could actually hear her say, okay, yeah, we have to break up because my mom and dad said our age difference is not okay. And right now, maybe later, but we're not allowed to date.
All the family thought that Brooklyn had, ended conversations with Chris, had ended contact with Chris, had stopped the relationship.
But friends informed detectives that Brooklyn had continued communicating with Chris in secret.
Brooklyn and Chris were still in communication and still talking to each other. And whenever Brooklyn would go home, she would hide her phone and still text Chris.
Brooklyn had become the typical teenage girl, sort of the rebellious teenage girl that was determined to get her way through things no matter what it took.
Coming up, detectives question Brooklyn's boyfriend and learn a different side of the story.
He said Chara loved him to death, so he was able to come around.
Seemed like a very unlikely person to commit a double murder like this.
But before police can figure out who is telling the truth, a stunning revelation turns the case upside down.
They were going to kill her, and he had to protect her.
In June 2017, police in Rockcastle County, Kentucky are investigating the murders of Henry and Chara Bryant. Detectives are interested in speaking with Chris Evans, the boyfriend of the Bryant's 16-year-old daughter, Brooklyn. On June 12th, they visit Chris at the home where he lives with his grandfather.
I went to speak to him, very friendly, personable, smiled, and agreed to come up, and he actually rode with me. I drove him down to the state police post to conduct an interview.
In his interview, Chris comes across more like a helpful and concerned young man than a hardened killer.
I characterize him as being the person that if you ran out of gas, Chris probably would be the kid that would stop and offer you a ride to the gas station, give you a ride down to the gas station and a ride back to your car. Friendly and seemed willing to help him.
Seemed like a very unlikely person to commit a double murder like this.
Chris denies any knowledge of the Bryant's murders.
Chris said he'd known the Bryant family for about 2 years, since he started dating Brooklyn back in 2015.
He said he loved her, they were very close, that he felt like they would be together forever.
When detectives confront Chris about the rumors that Chara and Henry had forbidden his relationship with Brooklyn, Chris admits that was the case. But he claims he had continued to keep a good relationship with both Brooklyn and her parents.
Chris did say at some point that the parents were a little bit concerned of the age difference, and he said, well, is it okay if we remain friends? He said Chara loved him to death, but she thought that they should kind of cool it as they dated. So he was able to come around and they could get together as friends.
According to Chris, he was actually at the Bryant's house the night before the murders.
The day that they had returned from Florida, he had gone over to visit, say hello, and then help them put away some stuff that Chara couldn't reach, so he was placing some folded items up on the top shelf.
Chris's story was that he came over, spent some time with the family, and left early in the evening. He said when he left, all was well inside the house. He seemed believable.
Following his interview, detectives offer Chris a ride home from the station.
So I was taking Chris back home. When I walked in, I noticed a gun under the bed. It was a .38 frame firearm. The handles were a little wooden handles, but they were a little bit off color. I made a mental note of that there was a gun present and accessible to Chris. I commented about the gun to Chris's grandfather. He actually said, oh yeah, told me about the gun. It was some historic and been in his family for some time. I'd asked Chris during my interview about a gun. Chris stated to me that he had never held his grandfather's gun, talked about he didn't have another gun, never had a gun, never fired a gun.
Detectives look closer at Chris's claims about his relationship with the Bryant family. They reach out to Brooklyn's siblings, and what they learn raises red flags.
Chris characterized it as, well, this needed to cool it a little bit. But they liked me, and they started to let me come around and hang out a little bit. Other siblings said, no, that's not factual. They had to break up, and they were not allowed to see each other. In fact, Austin said, no, he is not welcome and allowed to that house. He was too old to date her. She's too young. She's in high school, and he was not welcome.
Could Chris have attacked Chara and Henry Bryant after they forbade their daughter from dating him?
I began to focus my investigation primarily on Chris. And talking to other people about Chris, I talked to a gentleman who lived next door to Chris's dad. And he said, yeah, actually, I saw him shooting right before all this stuff happened, talking about the murder. And I was like, really? I said, well, what kind of gun was Chris shooting? And he goes, well, he said he bought it from his grandfather. It was a .38, about a 4 or 5 inch barrel, and it had kind of light color handles, like they were worn or old or faded. He described the gun that I had seen to a T. Chris stated to me that he had never held his grandfather's gun. However, now I have a neighbor of his dad saying, oh, yeah, he described that gun, that Chris had been out practice shooting it the week prior to the murder occurring. So I certainly wanted to follow up with Chris.
On June 21st, investigators returned to Chris's house with a search warrant.
That search warrant was to obtain that firearm for evidentiary testing. Chris then did say, well, yeah, I actually did have that gun. I did shoot it, I did practice shooting. So I asked Chris, well, why not just tell me that? You're not a felon, it's not against the law for you to have a gun. Why not just tell me? Chris said, I didn't want to get in trouble. I didn't want it to make it look bad on me.
Police also confiscate Chris's cell phone as evidence and immediately begin looking for any text messages exchanged between Chris and Brooklyn around the time of the murders on June 8th.
The text messages had been erased from June, I think perhaps about June the 11th. All the text messages before that were gone. So I knew that I was going to have to rely on a clearer, more defined search of the cell phone to be able to ascertain what communication had occurred between the two of them.
While the phone is sent for further analysis, police search Chris's vehicle.
I did find blood in the seat of the driver's seat of Chris Evans's car. I cut that section out after photographing it. I sent that to the State Police Forensic Lab for them to examine.
Unfortunately, the forensic tests will take time to process.
I believed that I had blood. I believed that it was going to be my victims, but I did not have those results at the time. But I had plenty enough to go back and speak to Chris again. I went to Chris's mother's house to ask him to come up and speak to me. I had no warrant, he was not under arrest, but I asked him to come up and speak to me on his own.
On June 29th, 2017, Chris Evans agrees to a second interview at the Mount Vernon Police Department.
I confronted him on lies that he had told that I could prove otherwise, that I believed that he was lying, and I didn't know if he was an evil person or a person had made a bad mistake in trying to help someone else out, but I wanted the truth. It was an awkward time for him because he stared at the table in front of me and he broke down and said, I did it. I said, you did what? He said, I killed him.
As Detective Loudermilk listens, Chris Evans describes how and why he killed his girlfriend's parents.
Chris offered details that he had conversation with Brooklyn, that she felt that her mom and stepdad were mean to her, that they were going to kill her and he had to protect her. So he said they planned on killing her mother and stepfather. He said that he drove over late that night, that he parked across the road, that he had walked up the driveway, she had opened the door to let him in. She walked downstairs, they opened the door. He actually drew how the room was laid out. I gave him a piece of paper and a pen. He drew the bed, he drew the door, he drew arrows showing that he went beside the bed. Brooklyn went inside and turned the light on. He said he shot Shara first. That was consistent with the scene. He said, then I raised up and I shot, and I think I hit Henry. But he kept coming, and I shot again, but I missed. And then he came over to me and he tackled me, and I shot again. For whatever reason, maybe he thought there was no more bullets, maybe he thought they were done. I don't know, other than Henry at some point made his way to his feet, walked around the corner to the bathroom, and was holding a cloth on his face. Chris then said he went inside, and he said, I shot one more time. I said, where did you shoot him, Chris? Because I needed to hear him to tell me. I can't tell him. Chris said, I shot him kind of in the upper part. And I said, what do you mean? Where's the upper part? And he said, in the head. That too was consistent with what we'd found at the crime scene.
He knows details that were not immediately known to the public, because those kind of details are not released. I mean, what's released to the public is, two people have been murdered and shot, but not where they were shot, how they shot, not necessarily that there was a huge struggle in this house.
No one else knew of all of those details, so I believe Chris was telling the truth. Based on that, of course, I charged him. Then I wanted to speak to Brooklyn, because now he is including Brooklyn in this.
Coming up, Detectives hear a different side of the story. But who is telling the truth?
You want to believe one thing, but like your stomach is telling you another.
In Rockcastle County, Kentucky, Chris Evans has confessed to murdering Chara and Henry Bryant, the mother and stepfather of his girlfriend. The 22-year-old has accused the victim's daughter, 16-year-old Brooklyn Reynolds, claiming that she asked him to do it.
After lodging him in the jail, I asked that he not make any phone calls and went to locate Brooklyn. Brooklyn, of course, is a juvenile. Rules are a little bit different. So even though I'm speaking to her as a suspect, I have to, of course, Mirandize Brooklyn, and I had to have her parents' presence. So her father agreed to allow me to speak to her and was present and was outside of my room as I spoke to her.
When Detective Loudermilk informs Brooklyn that Chris has already implicated her, the 16-year-old makes a surprising admission.
Finally, Brooklyn did say that she did plan with Chris to have her mom and stepdad killed. It was said to her, Brooklyn, you have just helped kill your mother and stepfather. Are you that good that you can talk a grown man into killing your mom and stepdad? And she said, yes.
Chris Evans and Brooklyn Reynolds are both charged with 2 counts of murder. Their community is stunned.
I remember it coming across the news, and I remember Chris's name being released, and it said their 16-year-old daughter had been arrested too. I was kind of in denial. I thought, Brooklyn and Chris could have never even began to think that the person that I grew up with for so long could have done something so horrible.
I was like, Brooklyn? Like, was that Brooklyn? You want to believe one thing, but like your stomach is telling you another. You know what I'm saying?
Friends and family of Chris Evans also have a hard time processing the news.
There was doubts of family members who came to me and wept, saying that he didn't do this. Chris did not do this. There's no way he did this. He's not like this. He couldn't have done this. You've got to be wrong. And my answer all along was, we go where the evidence leads us.
I think when you fall in love, you do stupid things for love. Everybody does stupid things for love, and Chris basically fell at the knees of Brooklyn.
I think the mixture of the two of their personalities and their relationship was a little strike of a match near an explosive gas tank.
Investigators obtained search warrants for the deleted cell phone records of Chris Evans and Brooklyn Reynolds.
Once, you looked at the cell phones, it's quite obviously they were in a very, passionate relationship. And quite obviously talking about what happened. There's some pretty incriminating text messages about the crime itself, planning on the crime.
Chris actually at one point suggested getting a ball bat and that he could shoot Chara because she sleeps close to the door, and perhaps Brooklyn could hit Henry so Henry couldn't run away.
Next, forensic analysts focus on the .38 caliber handgun taken from the home of Chris Evans.
We have swabs that we obtained from the chamber, the barrel, and the trigger guard. Of those swabs, I think 3 of those came back positive for blood, and they also came back definitely from my victim, Henry Bryant.
I think that was kind of the final straw on it.
In pretrial motions, it soon becomes evident the 2 lovers are poised to turn against each other.
She was going to maintain it was, it was all Chris's ideal, not her. It diminishing her role in it. Chris's, ultimately, his defense would be he was manipulated by her, and she was actually, put him up to it, and she was a manipulator, and he basically fell under her spell.
I think Brooklyn was the mastermind behind it, because Chris would have done anything she would have ever asked for. Chris was so infatuated with her, wanted to be with her. Brooklyn could say anything, and Chris would do it.
He worshiped the ground she walked on. He was a puppet on a string for her. She finally found the one person in the world that would do anything and everything she asked. That's the kind of child she was. It was her way or the highway. She wasn't allowed to be with Chris, so she ultimately killed her parents so she could be with him. It was dramatic, it was obsessive, it was possessive.
There's people who are led astray. There's people who get inside of a bubble and think we'll get away with this and we'll get to be together, and it's a short term. They only can see this far, and they don't think about the impact that it's going to have on other people.
With the evidence mounting against Brooklyn, her attorneys approached the prosecution about a plea deal. And on April 12, 2019, Brooklyn pleads guilty to a charge of complicity to commit murder.
I aided in the planning of shooting my mom, Chara Bryant, and my stepdad, Henry Bryant. Knowing what Christopher Evans planned to do, I let him inside the house on June 8, 2017 in Rockcastle County, Kentucky. I did not stop him from shooting and killing the victim.
In exchange, Brooklyn's possible life sentence is greatly reduced.
Back and forth with defense attorneys, we've come up with 23 years. And sure, she'll do at least 20 years in the penitentiary.
2 months later, Christopher Evans also takes a deal and pleads guilty to first-degree burglary and 2 counts of murder. He is sentenced to 60 years in prison.
Do you know that by entering a plea of guilty to these charges today that you're giving up your right to a trial?
Yes, Your Honor.
How do you plead to the 3 charges, 2 counts of murder and 1 count of burglary first degree?
Guilty, Your Honor.
I don't think that sentencing was enough. That doesn't count for the years to come. You know, Caitlin, Madison, and Austin don't have parents to go through the years with, and it doesn't justify all the tears that were shed.
The family doesn't really talk much more about the murder and what happened. We kind of focus on, how we can live on through there, or how they can live on through us.
I think that Chara and Henry should be remembered more than Brooklyn and Chris. Chara should be remembered as an amazing mother, very beautiful person. She had a wise, very wise soul. If you needed something, she'd give it to you. If you were hungry, she'd feed you. If you needed a place to stay, she's just a call away.
I would want Henry to be remembered from his personality, his funny personality, the smile he held on his face, the funny faces he would make at you when you were trying to be serious. There was always smiles.
In the northeast of Scotland, where the North Sea wind cuts through narrow streets and old stone buildings stand against the long gray winters, there's a town called Elgin. It is the kind of place where people recognize familiar faces in grocery stores, where school routes become routines repeated so many times they begin to feel permanent, where an ordinary morning rarely attracts attention. In April of 1998, Elgin was quiet. Life moved slowly there. Parents walked children to school. Shopkeepers opened their doors. Cars rolled through damp roads under low Scottish skies. Nothing about the morning of April 28th suggested that it would become one of the most haunting criminal cases in modern Scottish history. At first, there was no crime scene, no blood, no witnesses to violence, no body. There was only a woman standing outside her home, watching her children leave for school, before disappearing completely from the world. Her name was Arlene Fraser. She was 33 years old, a mother of 2. By all accounts, the beginning of that Tuesday looked painfully ordinary. That detail would later become one of the most disturbing parts of the entire story. Because when investigators reconstruct violent crimes, there's often a moment that feels cinematic, a scream, a struggle, a visible rupture in normal life. But in cases like this, horror arrives quietly. It hides itself inside routine. The final confirmed sighting of Arlene Fraser was not dramatic. There was no indication she was in immediate danger. She was seen outside her home in Elgin after her children left for school. Then, somehow, between that moment and the afternoon, she vanished. Hours later, her children returned home expecting to find their mother waiting for them. Instead, the house was empty. At first, confusion outweighed fear. Perhaps she had gone out unexpectedly. Perhaps she had stepped away briefly. But very quickly, small details inside the house began to feel wrong, disturbingly wrong. Arlene had left behind her contact lenses, her medication for Crohn's disease, personal belongings, items investigators would later believe she would never willingly abandon if she intended to leave. Voluntarily. Days passed, then weeks. Nobody saw her leave Elgin. There were no financial transactions, no phone calls, no confirmed sightings. It was as if she had simply ceased to exist sometime after that ordinary spring morning. And yet, despite the complete absence of a body, despite the lack of a confession, despite the enormous gaps in the physical evidence, Scottish prosecutors would eventually accuse Arlene's husband, Nat Fraser, of murder. Years later, a jury would convict him, not once but twice. But even after convictions, appeals, and decades of investigation, one devastating question has never been answered. Where's Arlene Fraser? Cases involving missing persons often exist in a strange space between hope and grief. Families cling to the possibility that their loved one may still be alive somewhere, even when logic begins to suggest otherwise. But the disappearance of Arlene Fraser slowly evolved into something darker than a missing person. Investigation. It became what investigators call a no-body murder case, one of the most difficult types of homicide prosecutions in criminal law. Without a body, prosecutors are forced to prove not only who committed the crime, but that a crime occurred at all. In Scotland, the case would become notorious precisely because of that challenge. How do you convict someone of murder when the victim has never been found? How do detectives reconstruct a killing when the most important piece of evidence, the victim herself, is missing? And perhaps most painfully of all, how does a family mourn when there is no grave, no funeral, no final certainty? Over time, the disappearance of Arlene Fraser would reveal allegations of domestic violence, coercive control, hidden fear inside a marriage, suspicious destruction of evidence, and testimony so shocking it changed the direction of the entire case. Investigators would become convinced that Arlene did not leave willingly. They believed she had been killed. They believed her body had been deliberately concealed so completely that it might never be recovered. Yet every theory led back to the same silence. Somewhere beyond the courtrooms, beyond the headlines, beyond years of legal battles and public scrutiny, Arlene herself remained missing. That absence became the defining feature of the case. The missing body transformed the investigation into something almost ghost-like. Detectives searched for traces of movement, fragments of truth, inconsistencies in statements, clues hidden inside ordinary domestic details. Every object inside the Fraser home began to matter. Every timeline became significant. Every contradiction carried weight. In cases involving disappearance, investigators often talk about the last normal day, the final moment before a life fractures into mystery. For Arlene Fraser, that day was April 28, 1998. To the outside world, it began like any other Tuesday in Elgin. But beneath the surface, tensions already existed inside the Fraser household. Arlene and Nat Fraser were not living inside a stable marriage. Their relationship had reportedly been marked by violence and conflict for years. According to later evidence and testimony, Arlene had tried more than once to leave the relationship. She was said to be preparing for divorce. Investigators would later conclude that those details were not background information. They were motive. The deeper detectives looked into the Fraser marriage, the darker the story became. But on that first day, before investigators formed theories and before prosecutors built their case, there was only confusion. A missing woman, an empty house, 2 children waiting for their mother to come home. There is something uniquely unsettling about disappearances that happen in daylight. People tend to imagine danger arriving under cover of darkness, hidden in isolated places. But Arlene disappeared after sunrise in a residential community, during the ordinary rhythm of a weekday morning. The familiarity of the setting made the case even more disturbing. Because if someone could vanish there in the middle of routine life, then safety itself begins to feel fragile. In the years that followed, the investigation into Arlene Fraser's disappearance would consume detectives, prosecutors, journalists, and the Scottish public. Courtrooms would hear allegations of violence and concealment. Witnesses would describe suspicious behavior. A mysterious Ford Fiesta would become central to the investigation. One witness would claim that Arlene's body had been destroyed beyond recognition. Yet even as evidence accumulated, one fact remained unchanged. Nobody could say with certainty what happened inside that house after the children left for school. No one witnessed Arlene Fraser's final moments. And perhaps that is why the case continues to haunt Scotland decades later. Because unresolved disappearances leave behind a different kind of grief. Murder investigations usually move toward a conclusion, a body recovered, a confession obtained, a sequence of events reconstructed. But in this case, the central figure never came home. Her absence lingered through every courtroom proceeding, every appeal, every newspaper headline. Even after convictions were secured, even after judges condemned the man they believed responsible, the mystery itself survived. Somewhere, hidden from public view, are the final unanswered moments of Arlene Fraser's life. Somewhere, perhaps, lies the truth investigators spent years trying to uncover. And somewhere in Scotland, a family still lives with the unbearable reality that their daughter, sister, and mother disappeared one ordinary morning and was never seen again. Long before her name appeared in newspapers across Scotland, before courtrooms debated her final hours, before investigators tried to reconstruct the circumstances of her disappearance, Arlene Fraser was simply a woman living an ordinary life in Elgin. Cases that later become infamous often lose something essential over time. The public remembers the mystery, the legal battle, the unanswered questions. But the person at the center of the story slowly becomes secondary to the investigation itself. In the case of Arlene Fraser, that transformation happened quickly. Her disappearance became one of Scotland's most disturbing no-body murder cases. Yet behind all the headlines was a 33-year-old mother whose life had already become overshadowed by fear long before she vanished. Arlene Fraser was born in 1965 and lived in the Moray town of Elgin in northeastern Scotland. Elgin is not a sprawling city where anonymity is easy. It is a close-knit community shaped by routine, familiarity, and long memory. People notice changes there. Neighbors recognize one another. Families become woven into the social fabric of the town over years and generations. By the late 1990s, Arlene was raising 2 children and trying to navigate the increasingly unstable reality of her marriage to her husband, Nat Fraser. To outsiders, the Fraser family may have appeared unremarkable. There was no obvious sign visible from the street that the marriage was collapsing under years of conflict. But investigators would later uncover a history that painted a very different picture behind closed doors. The relationship between Arlene and Nat Fraser had reportedly been troubled for years, according to later testimony and investigative findings. It was a marriage shaped not by stability, but by cycles of tension, fear, separation, and reconciliation. Domestic abuse cases often develop gradually, with control and intimidation intensifying over time until violence becomes part of ordinary life inside the household. In retrospect, investigators believe that pattern existed within the Fraser marriage. Arlene had reportedly tried more than once to escape the relationship. In 1990, she left Nat Fraser. Then again in 1992, she attempted to separate herself from the marriage. Those departures would later become deeply significant to detectives because they revealed a long-standing pattern rather than a sudden marital dispute. The attempts to leave suggested that Arlene's unhappiness and fear were not temporary emotional reactions, but part of a much deeper crisis unfolding over years. For victims trapped inside abusive relationships, leaving is often the most dangerous moment. Investigators and domestic violence experts have repeatedly noted that the risk of serious harm can increase dramatically when one partner realizes control is slipping away. In Arlene's case, prosecutors would later argue that the marriage had reached precisely that breaking point by 1998. By then, the relationship between Arlene and Nat Fraser had reportedly deteriorated beyond repair. Behind the ordinary routines of school runs and family life, tensions had escalated to alarming levels. Only weeks before Arlene disappeared, a violent incident allegedly took place that would later become one of the most important warning signs in the entire case. Nat Fraser was arrested after allegedly assaulting and strangling his wife. The injuries were serious enough that forensic medical specialists examined Arlene afterward. That detail mattered enormously to investigators because it established documented allegations of physical violence shortly before her disappearance. In many homicide investigations involving intimate partners, detectives searched carefully for escalation, evidence that violence was becoming more severe, more desperate, or more frequent before the victim vanished. Prosecutors later argued that the alleged strangulation incident represented exactly that kind of escalation. Strangulation occupies a particularly disturbing place in domestic violence investigations because it demonstrates direct physical domination and a willingness to exert lethal control. In Arlene's case, investigators would later view the incident not as an isolated argument, but as part of a broader pattern of coercion and abuse. Yet despite the alleged violence, daily life continued outwardly. That contradiction is common in abusive relationships. People continue working, raising children, attending appointments, and maintaining routines even while living under emotional strain that outsiders rarely fully understand. For Arlene, the pressures inside the marriage reportedly became unbearable. By 1998, she was said to be quietly preparing divorce proceedings against Nat Fraser. The secrecy surrounding those plans would later become a critical detail in the investigation. According to the case presented by prosecutors, Arlene feared her husband's reaction if he learned she intended to leave permanently. The decision to pursue divorce represented more than the end of a marriage. To investigators, it potentially represented the collapse of the control Nat Fraser allegedly exercised over family life. Throughout the later court proceedings, prosecutors portrayed Nat as a deeply controlling man unable to accept rejection or abandonment. They argued that Arlene's decision to separate threatened not only the marriage itself, but his authority and identity. It is important to understand that in cases like this, motive is rarely about a single argument or isolated event. Prosecutors often attempt to demonstrate an emotional trajectory, resentment building over time, anger deepening, control slipping away. In a Fraser case, investigators believed that trajectory had been developing for years. Arlene's repeated attempts to leave the relationship became central to understanding the psychological environment surrounding her disappearance. Friends and family members later described concern for her well-being. The image that gradually emerged during the investigation was not of a happy household disrupted suddenly by tragedy, but of a woman attempting to navigate an increasingly dangerous domestic situation. Yet despite those fears, Arlene remained focused on her children and daily responsibilities. That humanity sometimes disappears beneath the procedural details of criminal investigations. Court documents reduce lives into timelines, statements, and evidence categories. But at the center of all of it was a mother whose children expected her to be there when they came home from school. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of disappearance cases is how abruptly ordinary life ends. There is no emotional preparation, no final goodbye. One day, a person exists inside countless small routines, conversations, errands, family obligations, and the next day they are transformed into photographs used by police investigators and journalists. For the Fraser children, the loss unfolded in real time. Their mother did not disappear in some distant or abstract sense. She vanished directly out of their daily lives. The emotional weight of that reality would remain over the case for decades. As investigators later reconstructed the background leading to Arlene's disappearance, they became increasingly convinced that her vanishing could not be separated from the troubled state of her marriage. There were no indications she intended to abandon her children, no evidence she planned to disappear voluntarily. The deeper detectives examined her life, the less plausible voluntary disappearance became. That conclusion rested not only on the absence of physical evidence showing she left, but on who Arlene Fraser was as a person. She was deeply connected to her children. She maintained routines. She had responsibilities and medical needs. Investigators later pointed specifically to the medication she left behind after vanishing. Arlene suffered from Crohn's disease, a chronic condition requiring treatment. Detectives found it difficult to believe she would willingly disappear without medication essential to managing her health. Her contact lenses and personal belongings were also left inside the home. Each abandoned item became another small contradiction against the idea that she simply walked away. The ordinary domestic objects scattered throughout the house carried emotional significance because they reflected interruption rather than departure. Something about the scene suggested incompletion. A life abruptly halted. At the same time, detectives understood that proving homicide without a body would require more than suspicion. They needed to establish not only that Arlene had disappeared, but that her disappearance was inconsistent with voluntary absence. Every detail of her background, therefore, became critical. Her relationship history, the alleged violence, the divorce plans, the prior separations, the medical condition, the close bond with her children. Together, investigators believed those details formed a portrait of a woman who was trying to change her life, not abandon it. Yet the very intimacy of domestic violence cases often creates investigative difficulties. Violence inside relationships usually occurs in private. Witnesses rarely see the full reality. Victims may conceal fear from friends or family. By the time police become involved, much of the emotional damage exists only in fragments, arguments remembered later, injuries documented briefly, tensions noticed by others but not fully understood at the time. In Arlene Fraser's case, investigators would spend years piecing together those fragments in an attempt to understand what happened inside the Fraser home before her disappearance. The portrait that emerged was bleak. A marriage reportedly defined by instability and control. A woman trying repeatedly to leave. A husband prosecutors later accused of refusing to let her go. But even as suspicion increasingly focused on Nat Fraser, one devastating problem remained unresolved from the very beginning. There was still no body, no direct forensic proof of murder, and no witness to the killing itself. Everything investigators believed about the motive behind Arlene's disappearance had to be built from circumstance, behavior, and inference. That challenge would define the case for years to come. Because while the background of the Fraser marriage offered investigators a possible explanation for why Arlene disappeared, it still did not answer the central question haunting everyone involved in the investigation. What actually happened to her after that final morning in April 1998? On the morning of April 28, 1998, nothing appeared unusual in the Fraser household from the outside. There were no visible signs of panic. No emergency calls. No witnesses describing screams or violence. The day began the way countless mornings begin in small towns across Scotland, quietly, routinely, almost invisibly. And perhaps that is what makes the disappearance of Arlene Fraser feel so unsettling even decades later. The final hours before she vanished were wrapped in ordinary domestic life. There was no dramatic prelude warning the people around her that this would become one of Scotland's most notorious criminal investigations. There was only routine. The weather in northeastern Scotland during late April often carries the lingering chill of winter. Mornings arrive slowly there, under pale skies and damp air rolling in from the North Sea. In Elgin, daily life would already have been underway by the time children began leaving for school. Cars moved through familiar streets. Parents stood at doorways saying goodbye. For the Fraser children, April 28th initially looked no different from any other school day. At some point that morning, Arlene Fraser was seen outside the family home. It would become the final confirmed sighting of her alive. That detail alone carries enormous emotional weight in hindsight. There is something haunting about the idea that a person can be observed in one ordinary moment, standing outside their own house, engaged in routine family life, and then simply vanish from history. Investigators would later spend years attempting to understand what happened in the hours following that final sighting, but no one could reconstruct the exact sequence with certainty. The timeline after the children left for school gradually dissolved into silence. For families of missing persons, the final ordinary interaction often becomes psychologically unbearable. People replay tiny details repeatedly, searching for hidden meaning in moments that initially seemed insignificant. Did she appear frightened? Distracted? Was there any indication something was wrong? In Arlene Fraser's case, there was no known dramatic farewell. No clear sign she believed danger was imminent that morning. That absence of visible warning only deepened the mystery later. Because if Arlene truly vanished against her will, then whatever happened occurred rapidly and quietly enough to leave almost no immediate trace. As the morning turned into afternoon, the Fraser children eventually returned home from school, expecting the normal continuation of daily life. Instead, they found the house empty. Their mother was gone. At first, the disappearance may not have appeared catastrophic. Adults leave home unexpectedly all the time. Errands happen. Plans change. But very quickly, details inside the house began to create an entirely different impression. Some disappearances generate immediate alarm because of overt violence. Others become frightening because of what is missing from the scene. In the Fraser home, investigators later focused intensely on the items Arlene left behind. Her contact lenses remained there. Her medication for Crohn's disease had not been taken. Personal belongings, including items considered essential to daily life, were still inside the home. Her watch and wedding rings were also reportedly left behind. Those details became critically important because they contradicted the idea that Arlene had chosen to disappear voluntarily. Detectives understood that adults sometimes leave relationships abruptly. They walk away from marriages, families, or responsibilities. But people planning to disappear intentionally usually take necessities with them: medication, money, identification, clothing, personal items. In Arlene's case, investigators increasingly felt the house reflected interruption rather than departure. It looked less like someone had packed to leave and more like someone had vanished in the middle of ordinary life. The medication was especially significant. Crohn's disease is a chronic illness requiring ongoing management and treatment. Prosecutors would later argue that it was implausible Arlene would willingly abandon medication, essential to her health, combined with the absence of financial activity after her disappearance. The picture became darker with each passing day. No confirmed bank transactions occurred after April 28th. No verified sightings emerged, placing Arlene elsewhere. Nobody saw her leaving Elgin. The complete absence of movement after that morning deeply troubled investigators. In many missing person cases, some form of trace usually appears eventually: financial activity, travel records, phone calls, witness sightings. But Arlene Fraser seemed to disappear almost completely from observable life after the children left for school. The silence surrounding her disappearance grew heavier as days passed. Family members reportedly became increasingly alarmed. Investigators initially approached the case as a missing person inquiry, which is standard procedure when adults vanish without immediate evidence of violence. At that stage, police had to consider multiple possibilities. Had Arlene left voluntarily? Was she attempting to escape her marriage permanently? Had she suffered some kind of accident? Or had something far more sinister occurred inside the Fraser home after the children departed? Detectives began the difficult process of reconstructing her final known movements. They examined timelines, interviewed relatives and acquaintances, and attempted to determine whether anyone had seen or heard anything unusual on April 28th. Yet the investigation quickly encountered a disturbing problem. There was almost nothing to follow. The disappearance lacked obvious direction. No clear trail led away from Elgin. No evidence suggested Arlene had prepared for a new life elsewhere. Instead, investigators found themselves staring at absence of communication, absence of financial activity, absence of movement, absence of explanation. As detectives dug deeper into the circumstances surrounding the Fraser household, attention increasingly shifted toward the troubled nature of Arlene's marriage. The allegations of domestic abuse, previous separations, and ongoing divorce preparations suddenly became impossible to ignore. In many domestic homicide investigations, detectives later describe a moment when a missing person case stops feeling like a disappearance and starts feeling like concealed violence. In the Fraser investigation, that transition appears to have happened gradually but decisively. The more police learned about Arlene's situation before vanishing, the less likely voluntary disappearance appeared. She had children she was deeply connected to. She had responsibilities, routines, and medical needs. There was no evidence she planned to abandon her life entirely. Yet proving something darker had happened was extraordinarily difficult without physical evidence. Directly establishing a crime, that challenge would define the case for years. One of the most psychologically disturbing aspects of no-body cases is the uncertainty surrounding the victim's final moments. Without a body or confirmed crime scene, investigators cannot reconstruct events with precision. There are no definitive forensic answers explaining exactly when death occurred, where it happened, or how it unfolded. Instead, detectives must build conclusions through behavior, inconsistencies, patterns, and circumstantial evidence. In Arlene Fraser's case, the emotional power of the investigation came partly from that uncertainty. The disappearance seemed to exist in a void. There was no visible endpoint, only unanswered questions. Yet even in those early stages, certain facts deeply troubled investigators. Arlene had not contacted anyone. No evidence suggested she intended to start over somewhere else. The belongings left inside the home painted a picture of abrupt interruption. And hovering over all of it was the deeply troubled history of her relationship with Nat Fraser. Detectives knew statistically that intimate partners are often central figures in disappearances involving women. That reality alone did not prove guilt, but it shaped the direction of the inquiry from an early stage. As days turned into weeks, the atmosphere surrounding the case changed noticeably. The hope usually attached to missing person investigations began fading. In its place came a darker suspicion that Arlene Fraser had not simply disappeared, but had been deliberately removed from her own life. The possibility that her body had been concealed became increasingly difficult for investigators to ignore. Yet despite growing suspicion, there remained a painful absence of certainty. No witness described seeing violence occur. No remains were recovered. No forensic evidence conclusively established homicide. The entire case existed in a fragile space between intuition and proof. And somewhere inside that uncertainty stood two children waiting for answers that would not come. The emotional devastation of disappearance cases often extends beyond grief because families are denied resolution. Without confirmation of death, mourning becomes psychologically complicated. Hope and horror coexist simultaneously. Every unanswered phone call, every unconfirmed sighting, every rumor carries emotional force. For the Fraser family, the early days after Arlene vanished were likely filled with precisely that unstable emotional tension. The desperate desire to believe she might still return colliding with the growing fear that something terrible had already happened. Meanwhile, investigators continued trying to understand the final hours of April 28th. What happened after the children left for school? Who last spoke to Arlene? Did anyone enter or leave the house? Was there a confrontation? Was the disappearance planned? Those questions would eventually shape one of the most controversial and difficult prosecutions in Scottish criminal history. But during those first weeks, detectives still faced the same impossible reality confronting every no-body investigation. A woman had vanished completely from ordinary life. And the only certainty in the entire case was that after that final morning in Elgin, nobody would ever see Arlene Fraser again. As the days following Arlene Fraser's disappearance turned into weeks, investigators in Scotland faced a growing and deeply uncomfortable realization. This no longer resembled a standard missing person inquiry. The evidence was subtle, fragmented, and largely circumstantial. But taken together, it pointed towards something far darker than voluntary disappearance. Arlene Fraser had vanished without explanation, without preparation, and without leaving behind any meaningful trace of future movement. Detectives increasingly believed they were investigating not a disappearance, but a concealed homicide. The problem was that they could not prove it in any conventional way. There was no body, no confirmed murder scene, no direct forensic evidence publicly establishing exactly how or where Arlene died. In many homicide cases, the body itself becomes the foundation of the investigation. It provides timelines, injuries, DNA evidence, toxicology, cause of death, and often critical insight into the offender's behavior. Without that central piece of evidence, investigators in the Fraser case were forced to approach the inquiry differently. They had to reconstruct a probable crime through patterns, inconsistencies, relationships, and behavior. Every small detail became significant because there was so little else to work with. The investigation gradually focused on the troubled relationship between Arlene and her husband, Nat Fraser. Detectives reviewed the history of the marriage in detail. What emerged was not the portrait of a stable domestic partnership disrupted by sudden tragedy, but a long history of alleged violence, instability, and control. Investigators learned about the previous separations in 1990 and 1992, when Arlene had reportedly attempted to leave the relationship. They examined allegations of abuse and the reported assault only weeks before her disappearance, during which Nat Fraser had allegedly strangled her badly enough that forensic medical professionals examined her injuries afterward. Those incidents became critically important to detectives because they established a pattern investigators believed could not be ignored. In domestic homicide investigations, patterns matter. Detectives are trained to examine escalation, moments when controlling behavior becomes more desperate or violent as relationships deteriorate. According to the prosecution's later theory, Arlene's preparations for divorce represented a turning point inside the Fraser marriage. Investigators believed Nat Fraser could not accept losing control over his wife and family life. Yet suspicion alone could not sustain a murder prosecution. Detectives needed evidence connecting those fears to Arlene's disappearance itself. As the inquiry deepened, investigators began scrutinizing movements, timelines, vehicles, and personal associations surrounding Nat Fraser. One particular detail would eventually become central to the case: a beige Ford Fiesta connected to a man named Hector Dick. At first glance, the vehicle may not have appeared extraordinary, but over time, investigators became increasingly convinced that the car played an important role in what happened after Arlene vanished. According to the theory later presented by prosecutors, the Ford Fiesta may have been used to transport Arlene's body after her death. The significance of the vehicle grew even more alarming when investigators discovered what happened to it afterward. Hector Dick later admitted that the Ford Fiesta had been destroyed. The car was reportedly burned and crushed. That revelation transformed the vehicle from a suspicious detail into a potentially critical piece of concealed evidence. To investigators, the destruction of the car suggested panic and deliberate concealment rather than coincidence. Even without direct forensic evidence publicly linking the vehicle to Arlene, the act of destroying it carried enormous psychological weight in the investigation. Detectives began asking a central question: why destroy the vehicle at all if it held no connection to the disappearance? In many criminal investigations, attempts to erase evidence can become almost as incriminating as the evidence itself. The destruction of the Ford Fiesta suggested that someone feared what investigators might discover if the vehicle remained intact. But the case became even more complicated because Hector Dick himself initially faced criminal scrutiny. In the early stages of the investigation, authorities treated him not merely as a witness, but as a potential participant. That fact would later create significant controversy because it raised difficult questions about credibility, self-preservation, and the reliability of testimony. Over time, prosecutors shifted strategy. Rather than pursuing Hector Dick as a primary defendant, they turned him into a witness against Nat Fraser. That decision fundamentally altered the direction of the case. Hector Dick eventually provided testimony that became one of the most shocking elements of the entire investigation. According to his statements in court, Nat Fraser had discussed arranging Arlene's murder and disposing of her body in a way that would prevent identification. Dick's testimony suggested an extraordinary level of planning and concealment. According to the allegations presented during the proceedings, the body may have been destroyed so completely that recovery would become impossible. It is important to emphasize the distinction between allegation and proven fact here. The claims emerged through testimony during a highly contested criminal case, and Nat Fraser consistently denied involvement in his wife's disappearance. Nevertheless, Hector Dick's statements became central to the prosecution narrative because they offered something investigators had previously lacked: a proposed explanation for why no body had ever been recovered. No-body murder cases create a unique challenge for prosecutors because juries naturally ask the same question again and again. Where's the victim? In the absence of remains, the defense can argue that the missing person left voluntarily or that another unknown event occurred. Prosecutors, therefore, often rely heavily on circumstantial evidence and witness testimony to establish that death almost certainly occurred. Hector Dick's account helped prosecutors build a theory explaining not only why Arlene disappeared, but why she had never been found. Nat Fraser denied the allegations completely. Throughout the investigation and legal proceedings, he maintained his innocence and disputed the claims made against him. He also reportedly suggested that Hector Dick himself was implicated in the crime. That conflict between the two men became one of the most contentious aspects of the case because it introduced the possibility of competing motives, shifting blame, and compromised testimony. For investigators, however, the broader pattern remained compelling. Arlene had vanished suddenly after years of marital conflict. She left behind medication and personal belongings. There was no financial activity after her disappearance. A suspicious vehicle believed potentially connected to the case had been destroyed, and now a witness was alleging conversations about murder and body disposal. Yet despite all those developments, detectives still faced a deeply frustrating reality. The physical evidence remained limited. The body of Arlene Fraser had still not been found. The absence of direct forensic proof created enormous pressure on investigators to extract meaning from even the smallest details. One of the strangest and most unsettling developments in the entire case involved Arlene's wedding rings. During the investigation, authorities reportedly encountered a bizarre situation inside the Fraser home. The rings appeared in the bathroom after the house had already been searched previously. To investigators and family members alike, the incident was deeply disturbing. The idea that the rings could suddenly reappear raised immediate questions about whether someone had returned to the property after the initial disappearance. Detectives reportedly considered the possibility that the rings had been deliberately placed there in an attempt to manipulate the narrative surrounding the case. If true, such an act could suggest staging, an effort either to create confusion or to support the appearance that Arlene had left voluntarily. The emotional impact of that detail cannot be overstated. The rings were not merely objects. They symbolized the marriage itself. The relationship investigators already believed sat at the center of the case. Their sudden appearance inside a previously searched house introduced an eerie sense that someone connected to the disappearance was still actively attempting to shape the investigation from the shadows. Cases involving concealed homicide often contain moments that feel psychologically disorienting, rather than physically violent. The rings became one of those moments. They suggested intrusion, manipulation, and unfinished concealment. Meanwhile, public attention surrounding the case intensified. Scotland had seen missing person investigations before, but the disappearance of Arlene Fraser increasingly stood out because of the extraordinary combination of domestic violence allegations, missing evidence, destroyed property, and total absence of a body. Detectives faced mounting pressure to determine whether they could pursue murder charges despite the lack of remains. That challenge was immense. In criminal law, prosecutors must establish guilt beyond reasonable doubt. In no-body cases, that burden becomes especially difficult because jurors naturally expect direct evidence of death. Without a body, investigators had to rely on cumulative logic. They needed to show that every known fact pointed away from voluntary disappearance and toward homicide. Step by step, detectives attempted to build that framework. Arlene's medical needs suggested she did not leave willingly. Her close relationship with her children argued against sudden abandonment. Her belongings remained behind. Her marriage had allegedly become violent and unstable. A suspicious vehicle had been destroyed. A witness alleged discussions of murder and disposal. The rings had mysteriously reappeared. Individually, each detail might not conclusively prove homicide. Together, prosecutors believed they formed a coherent narrative of deliberate killing followed by concealment. Yet uncertainty still haunted the investigation. That uncertainty became the defining emotional atmosphere of the entire case. Detectives believed something terrible had happened to Arlene Fraser. They believed she was dead. But without physical remains, they could never reconstruct her final moments with certainty. There was no definitive timeline for her death, no confirmed location, no recovered crime scene publicly establishing exactly what occurred. Everything investigators built had to emerge from fragments. That reality transformed the Fraser case into more than a murder investigation. It became a psychological battle against absence itself. Every unanswered question amplified the horror. Somewhere, investigators believed the truth still existed, hidden in destroyed evidence, concealed locations, and the silence of people who refused to explain what happened after April 28, 1998. But despite years of investigative effort, despite witness testimony and mounting suspicion, one devastating fact remained unchanged throughout the inquiry. Arlene Fraser herself was still missing. By the time prosecutors formally charged Nat Fraser with the murder of his wife, the disappearance of Arlene Fraser had already become one of the most closely watched criminal investigations in Scotland. Years had passed since the morning she vanished from her home in Elgin. Yet the central mystery remained unchanged. No body had been found. No confirmed crime scene had been publicly identified. There was still no definitive forensic evidence proving exactly how or where Arlene died. And yet, despite those enormous gaps, investigators had reached a conclusion they believed with certainty. Arlene Fraser had not disappeared voluntarily. They believed she had been murdered. The challenge now was persuading a jury beyond reasonable doubt. In many murder trials, the prosecution begins with the victim's body. Medical evidence establishes the cause of death. Forensic analysis reconstructs violence. Investigators build outward from the physical reality of the crime itself. But in the Fraser case, prosecutors had to do something far more difficult. They had to convince jurors that a murder had occurred even though the victim herself remained missing. The trial, therefore, became a battle over interpretation. The prosecution would argue that the cumulative weight of the evidence pointed overwhelmingly toward deliberate homicide and concealment. The defense would challenge the reliability of witnesses, the lack of direct evidence, and the assumptions investigators had built into the case. The absence of Arlene Fraser dominated the courtroom from the beginning. It shaped every argument, every witness statement, every piece of circumstantial evidence presented before the jury. The prosecution's case rested heavily on motive, behavior, and patterns. Prosecutors argued that Nat Fraser had both the motive and opportunity to kill his wife. They pointed to the deeply troubled state of the marriage, the allegations of violence, the prior separations, the reported assault only weeks before Arlene vanished. According to the prosecution narrative, Arlene's decision to pursue divorce threatened Nat Fraser's control over the relationship, creating a motive rooted in anger, possessiveness, and rejection. Prosecutors presented the marriage not as a temporary domestic conflict, but as a long-term pattern of instability and abuse that had escalated over years. The alleged strangulation incident shortly before Arlene's disappearance became especially significant because it suggested increasing violence within the relationship. In domestic homicide prosecutions, prior acts of violence often become central to establishing intent and danger. The prosecution argued that Arlene's disappearance could not be separated from that history, but motive alone could never secure conviction. The prosecution also needed to explain the suspicious events that followed Arlene's disappearance. One of the most important elements involved the beige Ford Fiesta associated with Hector Dick. Prosecutors argued that the vehicle had likely been used in connection with disposing of Arlene's body. The destruction of the car, burned and crushed after the disappearance, became one of the strongest behavioral indicators of concealment presented during the trial. Jurors were asked to consider why a vehicle potentially connected to the case would be deliberately destroyed if there was nothing to hide. Although the prosecution lacked direct forensic evidence publicly linking the vehicle to Arlene's remains, they argued that the destruction itself revealed consciousness of guilt and an effort to erase evidence. The trial also focused heavily on the testimony of Hector Dick, whose role in the case remained controversial throughout the proceedings. Initially investigated as a possible suspect himself, Dick later became a prosecution witness. His testimony provided prosecutors with something they had previously lacked: a narrative explaining how Arlene's body could disappear so completely. According to Dick's statements in court, Nat Fraser had discussed arranging the murder and disposing of the body in a manner designed to prevent recovery or identification. The allegations were shocking. They painted a picture not of spontaneous violence, but of calculated concealment. Yet testimony from cooperating witnesses in criminal trials is often complicated. Defense lawyers frequently argue that such witnesses have motives to shift blame, protect themselves, or secure favorable treatment. That dynamic became central to the defense strategy during the Fraser trial. Nat Fraser denied involvement in his wife's disappearance and challenged the credibility of the allegations made against him. The defense emphasized the absence of direct evidence. No body, no murder weapon, no forensic confirmation of death, no eyewitness to the killing itself. They also challenged Hector Dick's reliability and highlighted the fact that he himself had initially faced criminal scrutiny during the investigation. In no-body murder cases, the defense often attempts to create reasonable doubt by focusing on uncertainty. Without physical remains, prosecutors cannot provide jurors with the clarity usually expected in homicide trials. There are no autopsy findings, no precise cause of death, no definitive timeline established through forensic examination of the body. The defense therefore argued that investigators had constructed a theory based largely on assumptions and circumstantial interpretation rather than concrete proof. But prosecutors countered that circumstantial evidence can be extraordinarily powerful when viewed collectively. They argued that Arlene Fraser's disappearance made no sense as a voluntary act. She had left behind medication necessary for her Crohn's disease. She abandoned personal belongings. There was no financial activity after she vanished. No confirmed sightings. No indication she intended to abandon her children or begin a new life elsewhere. Prosecutors argued that the totality of the evidence pointed overwhelmingly toward one conclusion. Arlene Fraser was dead, and her husband was responsible. Throughout the proceedings, the emotional absence at the center of the case remained overwhelming. Arlene herself could not speak. Her final moments remained unknown. The jury was therefore asked to interpret a mosaic of behavior, motive, concealment, and circumstance. The prosecution painted a portrait of deliberate violence followed by careful efforts to erase evidence. The defense argued that suspicion and probability were not enough to convict a man of murder. For jurors, the responsibility was enormous. Convicting someone without a body requires crossing a difficult psychological threshold. It means accepting that death can be proven through silence, patterns, and disappearance itself. It means concluding that absence can sometimes become evidence. In 2003, the jury reached its decision. Nat Fraser was convicted of murdering Arlene Fraser. The verdict represented one of the most significant no-body murder convictions in Scottish legal history. The court sentenced him to life imprisonment, with a minimum term of 25 years. During sentencing, the judge reportedly described him in deeply condemning terms, calling him evil and portraying the crime as one of extraordinary cruelty. Yet even after the conviction, the emotional reality of the case remained unresolved. Because while the legal system had delivered judgment, the central mystery still survived. Arlene Fraser's body had not been recovered. Her family still had no grave to visit, no confirmed location where she had been hidden, no final reconstruction of her last moments. The conviction answered one legal question, whether the court believed Nat Fraser responsible, but it could not provide closure in the traditional sense. In disappearance cases, conviction and resolution are not always the same thing. For the Fraser family, the absence remained permanent, but the legal battle itself was not over. In 2011, years after the original conviction, Nat Fraser's case returned to court. His conviction was overturned on appeal due to concerns regarding the fairness of the original trial proceedings. That decision immediately reignited public attention and reopened emotional wounds surrounding the case. For prosecutors and Arlene's family, the overturning of the conviction created the terrifying possibility that the man previously found guilty of murder might ultimately escape conviction altogether. Appeals in criminal cases are not declarations of innocence. Instead, they examine whether legal procedures were conducted fairly and according to proper standards. In the Fraser case, the appeal court's concerns focused on procedural fairness rather than disproving the prosecution theory itself. Nevertheless, the overturning of the verdict meant the entire case would have to be fought again. A retrial was ordered. The second trial carried enormous pressure. By that stage, the case had already occupied years of investigative effort and legal scrutiny. The public knew the major allegations. The emotional stakes remained extremely high. Prosecutors once again rebuilt the case around the same central framework. Arlene Fraser's disappearance, the troubled marriage, the allegations of abuse, the suspicious destruction of the Ford Fiesta, and the testimony surrounding concealment of the body. Once again, the defense challenged the reliability of the evidence and the absence of direct forensic proof. Once again, jurors faced the extraordinary task of determining whether murder had occurred without a recovered victim. In 2012, the retrial concluded with the same outcome. Nat Fraser was convicted again of murdering his wife. The second conviction carried immense significance because it demonstrated that two separate juries, hearing the available evidence years apart, had reached the same conclusion. For prosecutors, it validated the strength of the circumstantial case despite the absence of a body. For Arlene's family, however, even the second conviction could not fully heal the damage caused by the disappearance. Because despite years of investigation, despite witness testimony, despite court proceedings stretching across more than a decade, one unbearable fact still remained unchanged. Nat Fraser never revealed where Arlene's body was. The silence surrounding her final resting place endured beyond the verdicts, beyond the appeals, and beyond the prison sentence itself. That silence became one of the most painful aspects of the entire case. Families of murder victims often speak about the importance of recovery, the ability to bury a loved one, hold a funeral, create a physical place for mourning. In no-body cases, that process is denied. The victim remains suspended between absence and memory, never fully returned to those who love them. By the end of the Fraser trials, the Scottish legal system had declared Nat Fraser guilty of murder. But the deeper mystery at the center of the case remained unsolved. Somewhere beyond the courtroom, hidden from investigators and family alike, the truth about Arlene Fraser's final location remained buried in silence. Even after the trials ended, after the appeals were exhausted, after judges delivered sentences and courtrooms emptied, the central tragedy of the Arlene Fraser case remained unresolved. The legal system had reached its conclusion. Two juries had convicted Nat Fraser of murder. Scotland officially recognized Arlene Fraser not as a missing woman who might someday return, but as the victim of a deliberate killing. Yet despite all of that, one devastating absence still defined the entire story. Arlene Fraser was never found. Somewhere beyond the timelines, witness statements, and courtroom testimony, her final resting place remained unknown. And for the people who loved her, that reality transformed grief into something more complicated and more enduring than ordinary mourning. Most families facing loss eventually receive some form of finality. A funeral, a grave, a place to direct grief. Even in homicide cases, the recovery of a body often allows relatives to begin the painful process of emotional closure. But disappearance cases deny families that certainty. The missing exist in a strange psychological space where death is understood intellectually but remains incomplete emotionally. There is no final image, no confirmed ending, no physical place where memory can settle. In the case of Arlene Fraser, that unresolved absence became its own form of cruelty. Years passed, yet her family remained trapped between legal resolution and emotional uncertainty. Investigators believed they understood who was responsible for her disappearance, but they could not answer the question that mattered most to those closest to her. Where is she? That unanswered question lingered long after the headlines faded. It remained present through every anniversary, every public discussion of the case, every appeal hearing, and every mention of parole. The silence surrounding Arlene's location became inseparable from the crime itself. In many ways, the concealment of her body extended the emotional damage across decades. Cases involving hidden remains often leave families feeling as though the crime never truly ends. The victim is not fully returned to them. Mourning remains suspended. In Scotland, the disappearance of Arlene Fraser gradually came to symbolize that specific kind of unresolved suffering. Her case was no longer viewed only as a murder investigation. It became part of a larger conversation about domestic violence, coercive control, and the additional pain inflicted when killers refuse to disclose the location of their victims' bodies. One of the people most deeply shaped by that reality was Arlene's sister, Carol Gillies. Over time, she became a public advocate for legal reform, speaking about the emotional devastation caused when convicted killers withhold information about missing remains. Her efforts reflected a painful truth that many families of no-body homicide victims understand intimately. Even after conviction, the offender may continue exercising control through silence. In domestic abuse cases, control is often central to the crime itself. Prosecutors had argued that Nat Fraser could not accept losing control over his wife when she sought separation and divorce. After the conviction, some observers believed the continued refusal to reveal the location of Arlene's body represented a final extension of that same power. Whether viewed legally, psychologically, or emotionally, the effect on the family was undeniable. Without recovery, they were denied the ordinary rituals of goodbye. Carol Gillies' campaign focused on changing how the justice system responds to offenders who refuse to disclose the whereabouts of victims' remains. The argument behind such reforms is deeply emotional, but also practical. Families often feel re-traumatized when convicted murderers become eligible for parole while still withholding critical information about missing bodies. For relatives, the refusal to cooperate can appear not simply as silence, but as ongoing cruelty. Over time, those concerns contributed to broader discussions in Scotland about parole law and accountability in no-body murder cases. Decades after Arlene disappeared, legal reform finally emerged. In 2025, Scotland introduced what became known as Suzanne's Law, legislation requiring parole authorities to consider whether convicted killers have cooperated in revealing the location of victims remains before release decisions are made. Although the law was named after another victim, the disappearance of Arlene Fraser became one of the significant cases influencing public and political support for reform. The importance of that development extended beyond legal procedure. It represented recognition that concealment itself can continue harming families long after conviction. In effect, the law acknowledged that silence has consequences. Yet even legal reform cannot erase what happened in April 1998. The Fraser case remains haunting precisely because so much of it exists beyond certainty. No one outside those directly involved knows exactly what occurred after Arlene was last seen. Outside her home, no public account has ever definitively reconstructed her final moments. The body was never recovered. The landscape of Scotland still holds that secret somewhere. In true crime narratives, there is often pressure to conclude with resolution, to present a solved mystery, a final answer, a sense of narrative completion. But the reality of the Arlene Fraser case resists that structure. Legally, the courts delivered judgment. Emotionally, however, the story remains unfinished. The absence at the center of the case never disappeared. It simply evolved into memory. Cases involving domestic violence also force society to confront uncomfortable truths about how abuse develops over time. Looking back at the Fraser investigation, many warning signs now appear painfully clear. Repeated attempts to leave the marriage, allegations of violence, escalating conflict, and fear surrounding separation. Modern discussions of coercive control increasingly recognize that domestic abuse is rarely limited to isolated incidents of physical violence. It often involves patterns of intimidation, dominance, emotional manipulation, and fear that intensify gradually behind closed doors. The Fraser case became part of that broader understanding. It illustrated how dangerous the period surrounding separation can become for victims attempting to leave abusive relationships. Yet it is equally important not to reduce Arlene Fraser entirely to victimhood. Before she became the subject of a murder trial and public debate, she was a mother, a sister, and a woman attempting to build a safer future for herself and her children. One of the quiet tragedies of high-profile criminal cases is how easily victims become frozen in the moment of their disappearance. Their personalities, routines, and humanity are gradually overshadowed by evidence and legal procedure. But for the people who knew Arlene, the loss was not abstract. It was deeply personal and immediate. Her children grew up in the shadow of her disappearance. Her family spent decades without answers. Even now, the emotional damage caused by the case cannot be measured purely through legal outcomes. There's also something uniquely haunting about no-body murder cases because they challenge our instinctive understanding of certainty. Society often depends on physical proof to make sense of death. Bodies provide confirmation. They anchor tragedy in reality. Without them, cases can feel strangely unfinished, suspended between presence and absence. In the Fraser investigation, prosecutors succeeded in persuading juries that murder had occurred despite the missing remains. That achievement was legally significant. But psychologically, the missing body continued exerting enormous power over public imagination. People remained haunted not only by what investigators believed happened to Arlene, but by the fact that she had effectively vanished from the physical world. Somewhere in Scotland, investigators believe the answer still exists, perhaps hidden in remote land, perhaps concealed long ago in a way designed specifically to prevent discovery. The exact truth remains unknown publicly. And because of that, the case continues to occupy a disturbing place in Scottish criminal history. Not because of graphic violence or dramatic forensic revelations, but because of silence. Silence inside a house after children returned from school. Silence after phone calls stopped. Silence where a body should have been found. Silence maintained through years of investigation and imprisonment. The story of Arlene Fraser ultimately becomes more than a murder case. It becomes a story about absence itself, the absence left inside families after domestic violence destroys lives, the absence created when truth is hidden, and the absence that remains when a victim is never recovered. Even after convictions, appeals, and legal reforms, that emptiness cannot be entirely repaired. And perhaps that is why the case still resonates so deeply decades later. Because somewhere beneath the legal arguments and investigative theories is a profoundly human tragedy. A woman disappeared from ordinary life one spring morning in Scotland and never came home. In Elgin, the streets where Arlene Fraser once walked still exist. Daily life continues there much as it did in 1998. Children still leave for school in the mornings. Neighbors still move through familiar routines. Time moves forward as it always does. But unresolved disappearances leave marks that time cannot completely erase. They linger in memory, in unanswered questions, and in the quiet fear created by the realization that some people can vanish almost completely while those left behind spend decades searching for certainty that may never come. And somewhere, still hidden from view, lies the final missing piece of the story of Arlene Fraser. There are some criminal cases that, in the moment of verdict, is delivered. The courtroom doors close, the sentence is handed down, and over time the story slowly fades into legal history. But other cases resist ending. They continue existing long after the trial because something essential is still missing. The disappearance of Arlene Fraser belongs to that second category. Even decades later, the case feels unfinished, suspended in a place between resolution and uncertainty. The courts reached their conclusion. Investigators reached theirs. Yet the silence surrounding Arlene herself never truly disappeared. In many ways, that silence became the final character in the story. It lingered behind every headline, every appeal, every interview given by investigators or family members. Because no matter how much evidence prosecutors assembled, no matter how many years passed, the most important question remained unanswered. Where's Arlene Fraser? It is difficult to fully understand the emotional impact of unresolved disappearance unless you imagine what daily life looks like afterward for the people left behind. Most grief follows a painful but recognizable path. A death occurs. Families gather. There is mourning, ritual, memory, and eventually some fragile form of acceptance. But disappearance interrupts that process completely. The mind struggles against uncertainty. Human beings naturally search for endings, for narrative completion, for physical proof that allows reality to settle into place. Without those things, grief becomes unstable. Families live inside contradiction. They know the person is probably gone, yet part of the mind continues resisting finality because there is no body, no confirmed final location, no definitive reconstruction of the last moments. In Arlene Fraser's case, that uncertainty stretched not for months, but for decades. Her family existed in the shadow of a crime that could never be fully seen. And perhaps that is why the case still resonates so deeply within Scotland. It touches something primal about fear, loss, and invisibility. Arlene did not vanish in isolation, on a remote road, or in the middle of some chaotic public tragedy. She disappeared from ordinary domestic life. One moment she existed within the routine of parenthood and family responsibilities. The next, she was gone. That sudden rupture transformed everyday normality into something unsettling. The Fraser case also forced difficult conversations about domestic abuse in a public view. Looking back now, investigators and observers can identify warning signs that appeared before Arlene vanished. Allegations of violence, repeated attempts to leave the marriage, escalating conflict, fear surrounding separation. Modern understanding of domestic violence recognizes patterns that were not always fully acknowledged publicly in earlier decades. Abuse is rarely defined only by isolated incidents. It often develops through control, intimidation, emotional pressure, and a gradual erosion of safety within a relationship. The Fraser investigation exposed how dangerous the act of leaving can become for victims trapped inside coercive relationships. Prosecutors argued that Arlene's desire to divorce Nat Fraser represented a direct challenge to the control he allegedly exercised over her life, whether viewed through legal evidence or broader social context. The case became a stark reminder that the period surrounding separation is frequently one of the highest-risk moments in abusive relationships. Yet even while the case contributed to public discussions about domestic violence, it also revealed the limitations of the justice system itself. Investigators worked for years without the evidence most homicide cases depend upon. They had no recovered body, no definitive forensic reconstruction of death. Everything had to be inferred from behavior, testimony, patterns, and concealment. The prosecution succeeded in persuading juries beyond reasonable doubt. But the path to conviction remained extraordinarily difficult. No body murder cases occupy a strange place in criminal law because they challenge the instinctive human need for visible proof. Jurors must accept that absence itself can sometimes become evidence. In the Fraser case, the prosecution argued that Arlene's disappearance was too complete, too unnatural, too inconsistent with voluntary behavior to be explained any other way. Her medication remained behind. Her belongings remained behind. Her connection to her children remained undeniable. There was no trace of a new life elsewhere. Instead, prosecutors described a woman erased from ordinary existence through deliberate violence and concealment. The conviction of Nat Fraser was therefore significant not only for Arlene's family, but for the Scottish legal system more broadly. It demonstrated that murder could still be prosecuted even when offenders successfully concealed physical remains. But legal success did not eliminate emotional incompleteness. Because unlike most murder cases, the Fraser investigation never produced the final confirmation families desperately seek: recovery. Somewhere, investigators believed, the missing truth still existed physically in the landscape of Scotland. That possibility haunted the case continuously. Every remote area, every theory of concealment, every rumor carried emotional weight because of the desperate hope that Arlene might someday be found. But as years passed, the chances diminished. Nature changes landscapes. Memories fade. Evidence disappears. And still, the silence remained. There's another deeply unsettling aspect to cases like this. The person responsible for concealing the body may continue controlling the emotional reality of the crime long after conviction. Families often describe this as a second layer of cruelty. The offender does not merely take a life. They also deny mourning, deny certainty, deny burial. In some cases, investigators believe that withholding the location of remains becomes an extension of psychological power. The victim's family remains trapped in permanent uncertainty while the truth stays locked inside. Silence. That issue became central to the later legal reforms influenced in part by the Fraser case. Scotland's eventual adoption of Suzanne's law reflected growing recognition that refusing to disclose the whereabouts of victims' remains should carry consequences during parole decisions. The law acknowledged something families had argued for years. Silence itself can continue causing harm long after conviction. And yet, despite reforms and convictions, some mysteries simply refuse to disappear completely. The case of Arlene Fraser still contains invisible spaces no courtroom could fully illuminate. What exactly happened after the children left for school on April 28, 1998? Was there an argument? Was the violence sudden or planned? How was the body concealed so completely? Did multiple people know the truth? Those questions continue lingering because the central witness, Arlene herself, never returned. In many true crime stories, there is a temptation to focus overwhelmingly on offenders, investigations, and courtroom drama. But the longer this case endured, the clearer another truth became. The real cost of the crime was carried not inside legal documents, but inside the lives permanently altered by Arlene's disappearance. Her children grew up without their mother. Her family spent decades navigating uncertainty and grief simultaneously. Time moved forward, but the emotional wound never fully closed. There's also something symbolic about the way the Fraser case unfolded geographically. Scotland is a country filled with ancient landscapes, forests, coastlines, isolated roads. Stretches of open land shaped by centuries of weather and silence. Somewhere within that landscape, investigators believe the final chapter of Arlene Fraser's story remains hidden. That idea gives the case an almost ghost-like quality. Not supernatural, but unresolved. A life interrupted so completely that the physical evidence of its ending vanished with it. And perhaps that is why no body cases remain uniquely haunting in public memory. They deny us certainty. They remind us that even modern investigations, forensic science, and criminal courts cannot always recover every truth. Some answers remain buried beneath silence, time, and deliberate concealment. Yet despite everything missing from the story, one fact remains undeniable. Arlene Fraser existed. She was not simply a name attached to a criminal trial. She was a mother, a sister, a woman attempting to rebuild her life after years of reported turmoil inside her marriage. The danger she faced did not emerge from nowhere. It developed gradually inside ordinary domestic life, hidden behind familiar routines and closed doors. In the end, perhaps the most unsettling part of the Fraser case is not the mystery itself, but the ordinariness surrounding it. There was no dramatic final public sighting, no cinematic crime scene, just a woman standing outside her home one morning in Elgin while her children left for school. A moment so ordinary that nobody realized it would become historic. Then silence. Then disappearance. Then decades of searching for answers that may never fully come. And somewhere, beyond the court transcripts and police files, beyond the theories and convictions, the final truth about what happened to Arlene Fraser still waits in the dark, unseen and undiscovered.